word of prayer. Lord God, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to learn a little bit about you. Guide and direct us as we go about doing that. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen. Now, I didn't ask for prayer requests. I would like y'all to remember Peg and Van, who aren't here. Van's having medication issues. He has some physical stuff going on, but he's got medication problems right now, and he has fluid in his brain.
Oh, wow.
And they don't see that as, well, they're correcting it, but it's not like an emergency. So they're trying to correct it with medication before they do anything else, a shunt. And I think, because we were talking about it, y'all talked about age. He's taking medication for so many other things.
Yes.
That, when you combine medications, you don't know how they're good gracious. You see medications now that were developed to address this issue, and it does, but then they find it addresses these two. And so people start taking it to do these two things. And it just stands to reason that it's changing your body chemistry. Therefore, it's impacting you in a lot of different areas, and especially when you're combining them. And so right now, he's got a issue with medication being combined. It's just making him sick. And so I talked to Peg yesterday, and they went to the emergency room at the recommendation of a doctor. So they're trying to adjust that, get that adjusted, and they will. They'll figure out how to do it.
It's just that some fight each other.
Yeah, it's just so much of it is trial and error. I remember a woman I dated years ago who was a medical technologist, and she said, people think doctors, this is precise. She said, it isn't. They're just trying. They make assumptions and they're just looking to see what works. It's not like fixing a car. They're just trying to interpret symptoms and give treatments that they think will work, and if it doesn't, you do try something else.
Yeah.
So anyway, so we want to certainly remember, and for Ella Hendry's family, which is huge, because they're all dealing with.
What is today? Wednesday. I got to bake a cake tomorrow.
Okay. Well, thank you.
For the dinner.
Oh, for the dinner?
Yes.
Oh, I thought you were going to give it as a gift.
Saturday.
Yes, it's a Saturday.
It's for Saturday.
Yeah.
Oh,
I have to have it dinner Friday.
Oh, I
Yeah,
didn't know that.
because I've got to make sure it's up to snuff.
Yes, you have
So,
to.
it's not a hard job.
I don't have to make it. But I'll be serving.
I have to make one of those taster cakes like they do for
Oh,
weddings.
yes, absolutely, absolutely. Yes, I like it with ice cream. We're in the David story. In fact, we're finishing up the David story. Does she still have the thing she's chewing?
She ate it.
Oh.
That whole big thing, she ate it.
Oh, come here. Come here.
I think she was just kind of lost.
I didn't know where she was. Where am I at?
I don't know. Okay, we're coming to the end of the David stories. Now, how did the David stories start? We've been in the two books of Samuel. How did the stories
He was a shepherd.
begin? Okay, we've got David. Or this is a story.
Yeah.
First, we've got who? Who is right at the beginning of the Samuel story? That's not a trick question. Samuel, thank you very much. So Samuel is at the beginning of the Samuel stories, and Samuel does stuff, but it's almost to set us up for David, because David is the principal character in 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel.
No more.
And so we have David presented as a shepherd. What else are early ways that we see run into David? What are some other things that are associated with David early?
He was a warrior.
Okay, becomes a warrior. What else?
He gets persecuted by Saul.
Okay, is chased by Saul. What else?
Made best friend of Saul's son.
Okay, Jonathan. Okay, good. What else?
He was king, made king.
Okay, king. Early on the beginning, what became one of the things that certainly his military prowess, that he was a warrior. was a big deal. What else was a big deal? And I mention this only because this will continue to be as people look at David, and we're talking about much later, they're going to continue to associate him with this.
Goliath.
Playing the harp. Yeah, he's a musician. So so whenever you see in the Bible in the Psalm, gosh, half the Psalms are attributed to him because musician. So if you run into music, it must be associated with David. Just like you run into wisdom, must be associated with Solomon. That's what's going to happen as they develop. As things, even if it was written really late, you can tell by language.
Is it the same?
It's going to be associated with David.
This Solomon, is he the same one that said about dividing the baby?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
That's
Because
what I
that's, remember, that's what, we'll see that, because that'll be in the books of the Kings. Okay, so, first book of Kings. All right, so we've got David. He's associated, he's a warrior, he's a musician. In fact, in one strand of the stories, that's how he encounters Saul, through his ability to play the harp, because Saul is tormented by spirits.
He's a thief.
Well, okay, we should look at that as the David story develops. We've got this animosity between David and Saul, right? And the writer of the book of Samuel, or the redactor, the one who draws the stories together, what is Saul's problem?
He's jealous.
Okay, he becomes jealous of David. And there's a lot of problems between Saul and God that we've talked about, impetuousness and stuff. But Saul is jealous, tormented by spirits, goes after David. How does that story... And then we got a lot of stuff with David and Saul, and David's here and comes and stuff. And what ends up happening with David and Saul? How is that part of the story resolved?
They become, they're enemies.
Okay, they become enemies, although the writer seems to, in how he's shaping the story, gives us two instances where David doesn't kill Saul when he could.
Yeah.
So, the anime, and of course, in both of those, the resolution is Saul says, I don't want to kill you either. But then we have another story where he's doing it. So, we've got that kind of going on.
David doesn't want to kill Saul, though. Really.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and why would that be rough? But Saul does want to kill David.
Yeah.
He's seeking out David. Why would that be, as this redactor is telling the story to future generations? Because that's what he's doing. He's telling it to people 1,000 years later. Why wouldn't he have David just kill Saul? I mean, they're fighting one another. Why didn't you just have David kill Saul?
Because he was his king. David's
Okay, because who's king?
Saul was king.
Saul is king, and you don't lift your hand against God's anointed. So it would diminish David if David killed Saul. And so that's not the way he's presented. But he isn't presented as totally pure, right?
Nope.
Because what does David end up doing in these Saul-David stories? What are some of the things that aren't so hot that David does, or at least from our perspective?
Well, he does raids on different...
Okay, he's a raider. He has a little band, like in the Old West, of cattle thieves.
Yeah.
He goes and steals stuff from one city and takes it back and divides it up, but he never attacks
Saul.
He never attacks the city of Israel, but he does have he raids other places. And he's, at one point, protected by the Philistines. And that's the big enemy, when throughout the book of Samuel, the Philistines in the west and the Ammonites in the east. And so those are that Israel is always fighting. So how does the David story end up resolving itself? David-Saul story resolve itself?
Oh, Saul gets killed.
So Saul gets killed, and he gets killed. David doesn't do it.
No.
How does he get killed?
By one of the other guys.
Well, what ends up? What's the context?
In battle with the Philistines.
He's in a battle with the Philistines, Gilboa. Saul is
this young man to get killed.
right, and we've got that going on 2 slightly different stories, accounts of that, where he asks, the man doesn't do it, Saul kills himself, and another one, the man does it, and tells David. So we've got that resolved. So what happens to David once that, how is David presented? And that's really the end of 1 Samuel. How has David been presented early on in 2 Samuel? So Saul is gone. David becomes first king of Judah, and then later king of a unified Israel.
Yeah.
All right. How is David presented? How is what stories is the redactor choosing, and how is he shaping those stories to present David? What picture do we have
He
of David?
feeds his people, takes care of
Okay,
his
good.
people. He's
We
kind.
got David's feeding his people. What else is he doing?
He's kind to them.
He's kind to them. What else?
Talking to God.
Oh, he is constantly asking God for guidance. What else?
Built a temple.
He gets a city, right? Takes a city from the Jebusites and makes it his city. And what city is that?
Jerusalem.
Okay, it's Jerusalem. Gets Jerusalem. So Jerusalem becomes, in fact, they call it, the writer tells us, they now call it
City of
the
David.
city of David. So Jerusalem he's got. Boom. What does he do with Jerusalem?
Brings the ark.
He brings the ark into the city of Jerusalem, builds a house because the kings around Lebanon give him cedar, so he builds a house for a palace, brings the ark in, and says, if I'm living in this comfortable house with central air conditioning and everything, God's ark should be in a house.
Of his own.
Right, of its own, right? And Nathan, his advisor, says, good idea, until God tells Nathan.
No.
No. What is God? So God doesn't want David to build God a house.
Yeah.
Okay. Which would be
A temple.
a temple. Right. Not going to do that. Instead, God's going to do what? Going to build David a house. And this is a big deal, because David's house is going to be one of those signs that a Jew can look towards and say, I know God is with me. There are certain signs. I know God is with me. I know God is with me because God has given me the law. I know he's with me because I have the law. I know God is with me because I have the land. God led me to, I've got this land and it's mine, and I know God is with me. I know God is with me because God's given me a king. And not just any king, God's given me.
A good king.
Well,
Well,
they're not
they
all
think
going to be
he's
good, but what are they going to have in common? The kings that sit in Jerusalem, they're going to be Davidic kings. They're going to be kings in the line of David. So that becomes one of those promises that the Jews look to and say, I know God is with me. Now, interesting, kings in Israel, and we've already seen it twice in the books of Samuel. How does a person become, what is part of the ceremony in which a person becomes king? What becomes crucial in the ceremony? Did any of y'all watch any of the coronation of Charles?
No.
The crown.
Okay, well, they put a crown on his head, and the archbishop is there, and the scepter and the robe and all, and he's ready, and that becomes a sign that he is now king. Charles is king, because that's the ceremony. What was the ceremony that indicated that in this ancient Israel that an individual became king?
Sacrifices?
Well, sacrifice, you're right, was associated with him, but there was one particular action that was done to signify, and later it became symbolic action. It may have always been symbolic. What did they do? They didn't put a crown on his head. What did they do? They anointed a king. And anointing means what?
Blessing.
Well, a blessing, but something even more tangible and physical than that. What do you do when you anoint somebody?
Put oil on their head.
You put oil on the head. So they're anointed, a king is anointed with oil. Oil is poured on a king's head.
Oh boy.
Yeah, that becomes a sign. Priests as well. Priests are anointed as well. Okay, so a king becomes a king when oil is poured on his head. Now, because we're sophisticated people here, right?
Oh, yeah,
And
sure.
knowledgeable people here. What is the Greek word for poor?
For poor.
For poor, to poor.
Oh, that kind of poor.
Yeah, to poor. Not poor poverty,
Yeah.
but to poor. Greek word for poor. Greek word for poor is chrisma. Chrisma. That's the Greek word for poor. That's what it means. Therefore, the one on whom something is poured is called
King.
a Christus.
A Christus. Okay.
It's called a Christus. Because a Christus is the one on whom something is poured. And so every king of Israel, and we know that from like the second psalm, which was a coronation psalm, every king of Israel was called Christus, was called Christ in Greek. Because every king had oil poured on him. He was the Christus, the one on whom the oil was poured. Now, when the kings, and I mention that because when the kings become the sign of the promise, we know God is with us because of the king. Boom, we're going to see when we look at 2 Kings, the Davidic king is going to be removed from his throne. Not going to be there anymore because the Babylonians are going to take him and going to take him back, going to poke out his eyes. Bad news. So the king there's no more Davidic king in Jerusalem. So the Jews start, but that is a sign of the promise, right? The Jews start anticipating a future king, right? A future Christus, right? Or in Hebrew, Messiah, which means poured, the one on whom oil is poured. They start anticipating a future king that's going to do what? Restore Israel. Restore what was taken away, and then we'd be able to see God's promise again in the form of a person, in the form of a man who will personify God's promises to us. That's going to be really important in Christianity because Christians are going to right from the beginning are going to see Jesus as the Christus. Is going to see Jesus. Christ is a title. It's not a name. They're going to see him as the Christus, which the Jews anticipated. And that's why this is such a big deal that God makes that promise through Nathan. Because later Christians are going to say Jesus, and that's why both Matthew and Luke really work hard to connect Jesus to David. That's a big deal. That Jesus is from the tribe of Judah and is a son of David because Jesus is this Christus. John isn't important, doesn't care about it. Mark doesn't seem to know it. But that's a big deal in Matthew and Luke. That Jesus is the son of David. That's why they both give even genealogies to prove it, to show it. That's important to them. Okay, and that's what's happened when Nathan says to David, God's going to build you a house. Right here, David is at his peak, right?
Yeah.
He's defeated the Philistines. They've run back to the Mediterranean coast. He's feeding the people. He's issuing justice. He's established Jerusalem as his political capital. He's got the ark in the city of Jerusalem. Things are great for David and great for Israel. And then what happens?
David makes a mistake.
What is David's mistake?
Bathsheba.
Even before that.
He
He didn't go to war.
Yeah.
Where it says, when kings go to war, David stayed in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Because the writer even tells us the problem. The time of year when kings go out to war, David didn't go. Now, he hadn't gone before. The writer tells us right here. So we are being set up for a problem. And that's when we get this issue with Bathsheba, right?
Yeah.
And what's the end of this Bathsheba deal?
He ends up sending her husband to get killed, and he takes her as a wife.
It is sort of a classic, And the problem is, what does David? this guy, because Judy, you said he's constantly going to God, constantly going to God. What does he decide to do? He isn't going to go to God, right?
No.
What's his goal in the Bathsheba story?
He wonders his wife.
Geez, fortunately, we've moved past that in our history. People never try to cover things up, right? They openly admit things and face the consequences of their actions, right? We live in a world like that now, right? You know, that's what I hear announced in parking lot. Watch out, people take a responsibility for their actions. Yeah, I'm not thinking. You know, he does what human beings unfortunately tend to do. He tries to cover it up. And every attempt to cover it up fails. And so what does it force him to do? He's got to ratchet it up, right? He does these things to cover up what he's done, and they fail, so he has to take it to the
Next level.
next level. And what does he end up doing?
He fails.
Well, in a sense, he thinks he's fixed it, right?
Oh.
Because he does what? He has Uriah killed. Has Bathsheba's husband killed.
Yeah.
When she finds out she's pregnant, which is also becomes a problem. You know, he has him killed. And David does what? And the writer is almost matter of fact. Uriah dies. He gets word, although the writer lets us know that Joab knows exactly who's responsible. You know, so Joab is in on this, you know, secret. And he knows. The writer tells us in a very matter of fact way. Uriah, Bathsheba mourns for Uriah. Couldn't mourn long. Because,
He'd be showing.
yeah, that's right. Brings her into his house. She's now Mrs. David. Okay? What starts to happen to David after Bathsheba?
He starts getting weaker.
Okay, he starts getting weaker. First, he has to confronts Nathan, because Nathan does what with David? Because David confronts David, right? And what does Nathan say when he confronts David?
I don't remember.
Remember?
When he tried to tell David the parallel, and he said, you did it.
That's right, the man with the lamb, you know, and the rich man that had all and took the poor man's lamb, and David says, that guy is awful, he's scum of the earth, we gotta kill him, split him up. And Nathan says, oh, by the way,
It's you.
that's you.
Yeah.
That's you. And David goes, oops. You know, and Nathan tells him some things that are important, like the son that Bathsheba's carrying is going to die. And that, but I'm not going to let you go. I'm going to still, but you are going to face issues where? In your house.
Yeah.
You know, this house I'm building, you're going to have issues in your house. And David, his son, dies, and that's a very dramatic thing. The child that Bathsheba has, and that's David grieves until he dies, and then he doesn't grieve anymore because he knows that this is God. But this doesn't exhaust what's going to happen to David, because after that, Shelley, like you said, he gets weaker and weaker and weaker. And what are some of the signs? What we looked at him last week.
He doesn't go with his men when they go on the raids anymore.
Well, remember, the problem is going to be in his house, right?
Oh.
And he encounters immediate problems in his house. And where David in the past was, how would you describe him? Strong, decisive, almost aggressive in dealing with issues. Now David deals with these issues. He's passive. He's weak. People take advantage of him. They manipulate him to get their own interests, something we never saw before in David. But we see it. We don't even see the other side anymore. You know, that's all that happens. What is the story? And it's a horrible, horrible, horrible story. What's the story that starts to show, but this isn't the end of it, what starts to show this degeneration of David's family, David's house?
When his son kills the other.
Well, and why does the son? Yes. What son kills what son? Do you remember the names? Absalom, because Absalom's going to be a big deal now in this one. Absalom kills his brother Ammon. And why does he kill his brother Ammon?
He raped his sister.
He rapes his
Yeah.
sister. And he kills his brother. And in that, remember the whole thing, who was involved in that? David was, because he sent his daughter. Yeah, to help his brother, and his brother
Yeah.
had set it up so he could do this. Horrible story. And Absalom kills his brother. He hightails it out of town. David, this figure of great justice, how does he respond to this?
He mourns for them.
He mourns for his son who died, right? No, he mourns for who? Absalom. Oh, my Absalom, I miss him so much. You know, and finally Joab says what to him?
Get over.
Yeah, get over. We'll bring him back. If you're going to be like this, we'll bring him back. And they bring him back, but David says, "Oh, I can't see you. You can't come because you killed your brother."
Yeah, can't see
You know,
his
and so
face.
he's there in Jerusalem. And what does Absalom do? Which shows some of his character that becomes important here. Because Absalom wants what? When he comes back,
Wants to be.
he wants to be on the inside.
Yeah.
He wants to be at the palace, right?
Yeah.
And so how does he get himself back in the palace? What any person would do. He sets Joab's fields on fire. Yeah,
Okay.
and Joab comes and says, "What the heck are you doing? Setting my fields on fire?" And Absalom says,
He'd been trying to get a hold of him. He was being ignored.
yeah, that's right. You weren't responding to my texts. I would like to be back in my father's good graces. And Joab says, "I'll see what I can do." And what happens with Absalom? He's brought back in.
He goes to be back, yes.
Right, and how does Absalom deal with his father before we get to chapter 15? Through this, does he show David respect?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
Lord,
Yeah.
have mercy. He is so respectful to David. All right, chapter 15. So we've got David here, you know, that's there. Now, so I already said, trouble in the family, right? All right, right at the beginning, and we're gonna say, we're not gonna tarry through this because it's a story that kind of drives itself. Okay, who do we have right at the beginning of chapter 15? Absalom. And my goodness gracious, what does Absalom do? Now, this is a guy who was showing enormous respect to his father. So grateful to be back in his father's good graces, to be back at court, to be back at the house, David's house. What does Absalom start doing?
Taking people who has complaints and dealing with them.
He goes with his guys, with his boys, his posse, and where does he go?
Outside.
He goes outside the city gates.
Yes.
And who is he looking for outside the city gates?
People that are coming into.
Yeah, coming into the city for justice,
Justice.
lawsuits and stuff. And what does Absalom tell him?
No one can talk to him.
Yeah, oh, you're going in there, going into the city to talk to who?
David.
Yeah, my dad or one of his officials. Well, you're pretty much what? Wasting your time because they ain't going to talk to you, right? So what does he do outside the gate? So Absalom, don't go in the city for any kind of justice, right?
He listens to their problems.
I'll listen.
Tells-
Don't even talk to my dad.
Yeah.
He doesn't care. My dad doesn't care about you. But you know something? I do. I am one of the people. I care. Then he tell me your problems, and I'll see what I can do. And what do the people do?
Come to
Oh,
him.
They tell Absalom their problems. What does the writer say Absalom is doing?
Building up so he can be king.
Well, he's stealing the hearts of the people. He's not an idiot. You know, he's telling the people what they want to hear.
Yes.
Exactly what they want to hear. So they support him, right?
Yeah.
Now, how long does he do this?
This is 40 years.
He
Yeah.
does it for 4 years. Now, why? Not a surprise that it's 4, not 3, because 3 is
perfect.
a perfect number. What is Absalom doing? He ain't doing something perfect, right?
He's trying to steal the
You know, he's doing something very imperfect. 4 is usually often a number associated with the earth because there are 4 points to a compass. And so things in 4 usually have to do with earthly stuff. 3 has to do with heaven.
He wanted to be appointed judge.
Well,
Really
David
judge.
is doing it, but he's doing this. Now, is this a good thing to do? I mean, is he really practicing justice? No, we know because he says that he stole the hearts of the people. You know, so that's what he's doing. Now, after 4 years, what does Absalom decide he's going to do? What does he say to his dad?
He wants to go to Hebron.
I want to go to Hebron. Do we get a sense that David knows what Absalom has been doing for 4 stupid years? Well, maybe, I don't know. But, geez, if he either didn't know, which means he's ignorant, or he did know, which makes him stupid, thank you. If you say it in Hebrew, it sounds better. But he's either stupid or ignorant. Are either one of those good qualities?
No.
Heck no. You know, so David is again this kind of passive guy. You know, Dad, I want to go to Hebron. Why do I want to go to Hebron?
To fulfill a promise he made to
A
God.
promise I made to God. I'm going to go to Hebron. And I'm going to fulfill a promise. Now, why is that in a significant city? We've heard it before. What's the significance of Hebron?
The capital of Judah.
Okay, that was the capital of Judah. And in fact, that was the place where, before David conquered Jerusalem, that's where David was made king. And so Absalom is going there. Now, we, the reader, we aren't stupid, right? Based on what the writer has told us, what do we suspect Absalom's going to do in Hebron? What do we suspect he's doing? Because the writer is a pretty good writer. What do we think he's going to do? Is he sincere in offering sacrifices to God?
No.
No. We don't see him as sincere because that's not the way he's been presented. Who tells him to go in peace? David. Okay, so maybe he's not clueless. Maybe David isn't clueless, right? Maybe Absalom is doing what he promised, right? He's going there, going to perform sacrifices, going to be spiritual, maybe, right? What does Absalom do?
Build up people who want to follow him.
Okay, he starts getting people, to follow him. Now, supporters. Now what is Absalom doing? What's he about to do?
Get the people to make him king.
Okay, this is a coup, right?
Yep.
He is going to overthrow the government of who? David, who is his father. He's going to overthrow David's kingdom. And in the story, we don't have any reason for all of a sudden this animosity between Absalom and David. David's been pretty generous towards Absalom.
I was going to ask that.
Yeah, we haven't. The writer hasn't said, well, David punished Absalom and wouldn't see him. We don't get any of that. In fact, if anything, he's been kind of soft on Absalom. Absalom's going to overthrow, which tells us about Absalom. He is rotten and strong, but rotten.
But he also has ego and he wants power.
Yes.
He wants what they
David
want in the
had.
world today.
Yeah, absolutely. He's going to overthrow. He's going to take power from David.
Yeah.
All right?
Do you think that the reason for that is because David didn't do anything about the rape of his daughter?
Well,
He did.
what impression do we have about Absalom's motive? Because again, how has the writer presented Absalom? Do we see nobility in Absalom?
No.
We don't see nobility in Absalom. If we do, I don't know where it is. Could his motives have been, I don't know, historically, I don't know. But as presented here, we don't have Absalom working on good motives. I mean, he kills his brother, but he kills his brother in even that's not he exacts revenge, but even a backhanded way, inviting him to the shearing party, and sort of getting his...
He's self-centered. He wants himself to look good all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not a good guy here. And I don't know that the writer has anything in that would call us to say, well, poor Absalom. This is a pretty rotten guy, And he gets these people. Does David find out?
Yes.
Does David find out about Absalom? And if we didn't know what he was doing, the writer tells us in verse 13, doesn't he?
Yeah, that's what we told him.
Yeah, the messenger comes to David and says, the writer tells us exactly what Absalom is doing in case we had any doubt. And now David, remember, mighty warrior, close to God, incredibly just, decisive in his action, great king of Israel. How would we expect David to act when he gets this news about Absalom?
We'd expect him to fight back.
We'd expect him to fight back. Take the bull by the horns. I'm gonna have to put that boy in his place.
Yeah.
How does David react?
He runs away.
Please.
I gotta get out of town.
Yeah.
I gotta get out of town. I gotta run away. Wow. And what does David do?
Leaves immediately, all his people go.
He gets all his household, and he gets out of town. And it's kind of interesting because the people that are listed, which makes it even really sadder, who is emphasized in terms of the people who are leaving with David? What do they have in common?
They were his servants?
Well, they're in his service. What kind of people are they?
They love David.
They love him,
Yeah.
right? They're foreigners.
Yeah.
They're foreigners. Those are the ones they're following, not Israelites. They're foreigners. Now, David decides to do, because, he wants somebody to take care of the house while he's going. He needs some house sitters. So what does he do? Leaves 10 concubines. Now, I bet you that's going to be important in the story later. Because the writer wouldn't put it in there unless it was important later. Because he's a good writer. Okay, so he leaves, and then he has a little conversation with Attai, the Gittite. What is the little conversation he has?
He tells him he doesn't know why they would come with him when he was a foreigner. He might be wandering around.
Yeah, don't go with me, you're a foreigner. Go back. And in that little conversation, David says something that is really, really pathetic. What does he say?
Told him to go back with Absalom.
Right? Go back to Absalom. What is he acknowledging about Absalom?
That Absalom is stronger than he is.
That Absalom is king. He calls Absalom king. Even though, and I don't think that's it, because I can't assume there are accidents or coincidences. The writer starts that by saying, the king says. And then in what the king says, he says, Absalom is king. David is, at best, a shell of himself. And telling this foreigner to go back. And what does the foreigner say to him? That David doesn't seem to recognize anymore.
Their servants will stay with him no matter what.
That servants are going to stay, yes. And that the Lord is, this foreigner's reminding David, the Lord is here. But David doesn't realize it. So Judy, one of the things you said was the strength of David doesn't even have anymore. Not a mighty warrior. Not a man close to God. Not decisive anymore. Not strong. David is
Weak.
He's a mess. And why is he a mess?
Because he can run against what God teaches.
Because,
And he didn't bring God into the decision.
therefore, because God. This is God's story. This is why he's a mess. Okay, so David is going, who goes with David? Now we got this little conspiracy kind of stuff going on. Who ends up going with David?
The foreigners.
The foreigners, but not just the foreigners. Who else ends up going with him? The three. Okay, Abiathar and Zadok. And they are priests because they are taking with them out of Jerusalem the ark. And what does David tell them to do? Take it back. You got to take the ark back. So you got to take the ark back. So what do these guys end up doing? They take it back to the city, right? Now, David ascends to the Mount of Olives, verse 30, right? And what is he doing on the Mount of Olives?
Weeping.
Okay, he is weeping. He is barefooted. His head is covered. All right, he's in mourning. What does that as a Christian, this scene is duplicated in the New Testament. This same thing on the Mount of Olives, because it reminds something that the evangelists and is incorporated into Jesus' life, right? Because what does Jesus do? Same thing on the Mount of Olives. Okay, same sort of thing. And in fact, David ends up doing what on them? Not only does he show grief, he seeks God's direction, right? You know, that the advice of his advisor, who is now advising Absalom, be turned to foolishness, which is kind of interesting because it doesn't. That doesn't happen. David's going to come out of this, but it's not because the advice is bad. Because on the mountain, what starts to develop? What does David start to do as he's on this Mount of Olives? What person kind of shows? Okay, he's praying. What else does he in worship? What place with worship? What ends up starting as he's up there on the mountain? Because he's asked for God's help, right? Mm-hmm. Turn its foolishness. So if we assume God would do that, but what does David start to do up there on the hill as he's getting out of town, trying to escape his son?
It sounds like he's trying to make a plan.
Okay, good. He starts to make a plan, right? And what's the plan? So it's really interesting. He prays, make God turn the advice from this person into foolishness. Right after that, let me make a plan. We're going to start making a plan. And what's the plan?
He sends his friend
Okay.
into the city.
Hushai is I'm going to send him in, but I'm not going to send him in alone. Who else? Who are you going to make contact with when you get into the city? The two priests. Okay, you make contact with the two priests. Okay, and what are you gonna what are they gonna do? This is going to be a plan, right?
They're going to tell
Okay.
me what's going on.
Okay, so they're going to be the inside guys. They got sons. I'm going to find out. I'm going to be able to know what's going on in the city with Absalom, with you there, and you need to ingratiate yourself. You need to get in with Absalom. And you just pass information on to the priests who are there, and I'll get information about what's going on. Okay, this, if nothing else, shows how sad David has become. What happens at the beginning of verse 16?
He met Ziba.
Yeah, he met Ziba. Right. And what does Ziba tell him? Now remember this Mephibosheth. What's his story?
Well, he had donkeys, string of donkeys saddled with bread.
Yeah, he's Jonathan's son, and he's lame, right?
Yeah.
He's the one that's lame that David didn't kill, right? Mm-hmm. Instead restored Saul's land, and Ziba is going to be the sort of the steward of the land, but this is going to be, what has this lame son of Jonathan done?
Brought, like I
He
said, brought
wants
him food.
he wants the kingdom.
Yeah, so he's going in, because he thinks by getting close to Absalom, he might end up being king. So what has he done? And this is a guy that David should have. I mean, we would have expected him to kill, right? Not we wouldn't have wanted him, but this was a sign of David's mercy and compassion and generosity, that he didn't kill this person that he could have killed, a rival for the throne. That rival for the throne, instead of showing any kind of gratitude here, is looking to see how he can profit from David's fall. And then David does what to Ziba, who gives him this information?
He gives him the land. and
Okay.
he gives it to
You're going to get this land.
He restored it back to him. It wasn't restored.
Yeah, well, you're going to get now your master's land, because he's now in Jerusalem. You're going to get your master's land. I'm going to give it to you. Now, it can't get worse than this. David is marching across country. Does it get worse? Yeah. What happens as he's marching across country? Just gets better and better. He's going across country.
It's cursed.
He gets cursed. And what else happens to him?
stand.
He gets stones thrown. So he's marching, and his son is rebelling against him. He's retreating, and this guy is doing what?
Throwing stones at him.
Stalking him and
Follows him where they're going.
and throwing stones and curses him.
Yeah.
Jeez Louise, David is a mess, right? David is a mess, and
Calls him
they
a scoundrel.
calls him a scoundrel because the guy is from the tribe of Benjamin,
Yeah.
and who was from Benjamin? Saul was from
Saul was.
Benjamin. So this Benjaminite resents David and is throwing stones and cursing him. And David is just, David, we could take this guy out if you want. What does David decide to do? Let him do it. And so as David's marching down, you got a guy throwing rocks at him, cursing him. Well, it's got to get better, right? It's got to get better. Scene shifts to Jerusalem. Who shows up in Jerusalem?
Absalom.
Okay, Absalom's in Jerusalem. All the Israelites are there in Jerusalem. This advisor of David's there, the smart guy. We'll find out he's really smart. Who shows up? David's friend, right? And how does Hushai get on the inside? How does he get? Because he shows up, Absalom is there. How does he ingratiate himself to Absalom?
He said he served his father, so now he'll serve.
And I will serve you, which is a story he's heard before, because that's the other advisor. Okay, so he gets inside. Now, Absalom is there in Jerusalem. Who does he turn to for advice?
Who?
Yeah, Ahithophel.
Oh, okay.
Turns to for advice, yeah.
Okay. I kind of came in late and I only
Yeah.
studied so far.
Yeah.
What chapter and what verse are you on?
We are on verse 20 now of what, chapter 16? 16. Okay, 16,
I didn't
verse
know
20.
Yeah, I'm thinking, okay, I know I studied this last year,
Okay.
but I'm losing it.
All
Got
right,
it.
now,
Thank you.
he's there. He turns to advice. And what does this man tell Absalom to do?
Lie with your father's concubines.
Okay, now David left concubines. Now remember, this is a guy who's known for giving good advice. He's left 10 concubines. You need to take them. Now, why is that a big deal?
Because they were his fathers. and
Because they
David's.
were his fathers. What would Absalom be doing by taking the concubines? Now, we read this and say, oh, well, morality.
Sort of
But
spitting in David's face.
in a sense, remember we saw the same thing earlier
What you want?
with Saul's son. And that's what he accused Abner of doing.
Yeah.
Because that's a power play. That's asserting power. If you take his concubines, what are you in essence saying?
Taking his,
I am now the one in charge, and you need to do it in a way that is public. And so what does he do?
He gets it up on the top of the,
He
Right
sets
up
a
there.
tent up on top of the palace, and by gum, he goes about his business. And in the face of all of Israel. Now, that's asserting power. Why is that good advice? Why is that good advice for Absalom? Why would this be an example of good advice, not bad advice?
because he's showing that he's in charge.
Shows he's in charge. Absalom is showing he's in charge, showing that he is
King.
strong,
I hope he-
decisive, king, good king material. If he doesn't, then people might look and say, well, maybe David is still king. His son is afraid to do this, and so we don't follow him. All right, so Absalom has done it. Good advice. So, taken charge. He is now the master of his domain, right? What does the advisor then tell Absalom he needs to do?
go after David.
You got to go after David. And you got to go after David when? Now. You got to go after him. You got to go after him now. Why do you need to go after him right now?
Because he's weary of waiting.
Because he's weary. You're not going to find him in a place where he is weaker than he is now.
Yeah.
This is the time to strike. I hear there's a guy following him, throwing rocks at him and cursing at him. I think you and your army can take him because he is incredibly weak. This is my advice to you. Now, based on, if this weren't God's story, but this is God's story, what should Absalom do?
Just kill
Go
the
after
king.
David.
He should go after David. He should go after David. Because this is great advice. But this isn't Absalom's story, and this isn't David's story. This is God's story. So who steps up after this good word of advice?
Hashai.
Hashai steps up. And he says what?
That was bad advice.
Yes.
What's that?
He said that was bad advice.
That's horrible advice. Horrible advice. Why does he say it's horrible advice?
Because he said David.
Oh, jeez.
I was asking him, and he goes,
Oh, yeah.
The answer was.
David is men were fighters. They were
Okay,
strong.
David is, you're underestimating David. This guy says he's weak and discouraged and you can take him, but David is a fighter. And his men are fighting. Now we, the reader, know what?
If they're weak. They're tired.
That David could not be weaker than he is. He's a mess. Even though he has had raisins. He did get raisins. They did give him raisins, and that made him feel better. But he's a mess. So strike him while the iron is hot. But he says no. Hashai says no, can't do it. David's a fighter, and his men. I've seen them
fierce.
fight. Man alive! So what should you do? What does Absalom need to do?
Get one man.
You got to build an army. You can't send out your little dinky forces now. You got to build an army, right? And because they're good fighters. And not only do you need to build an army, what else you need to do? If you really want to get David,
He has to lead him into battle.
you got to lead him. You got to lead him. So you take time. You gather people from all of Israel. Build yourself a big army. And you've got to lead that army. And if you do that, you're going to win. You're going to win. Now, we, the reader, know what's motivating his advice.
He's a friend of David.
He's a friend of David. So, is his advice good?
For David.
Yeah, for David, yeah. It ain't good for Absalom. He's not saying this for Absalom to win. Who does Absalom, because, again, this is God's story. Whose advice does Absalom follow?
Second.
The second, okay. Okay, so he decides to do, right? And of course, Hassan does what? Does exactly what he calls in the two priests, get word to David, this is what you're going to do, but tell David, don't hang around west of the Jordan because you're still vulnerable. Get east of the Jordan in Gilead. And we've seen Gilead before. Usually they're running away from Philistines. That's why they go to Gilead. So go to Gilead, all right, and then this is what's going to happen. So what ends up happening when they get the message, because there's a little drama getting the message through.
You guys went to the well.
Right, there, which again reminds us that this isn't there, so this is God. God's in control of all of this. Goes to a place, some of Absalom's people are looking for him. They hide in a well. It was kind of cool. Hide kind of in a hole. And what do they put on the hole?
Cover.
Yeah, they put a cover and she puts what on the cover? A little bit of grain, so it looks like it's grain, and they search and they don't find him, so they go home. So, but in all of this, we know this is going to happen because who's in charge? God's in charge of this. And we know, because this is, like I've said before, this is like an episode of Columbo. We know what's going to happen at the end because we know the story. This isn't a story that the reader don't know. We know David's going to continue to be king and not Absalom. So we know he's going to win. We already know that. So this is sort of how he's going to win. When they bring the message to David, what does David do? He crosses the Jordan. He goes to the other side of the Jordan. Now, when that first advisor finds out his advice isn't followed, what does he do? Okay, what's that?
Went back home.
Gets on his donkey, goes back home. Now, we know his advice, because the writer has told us, his advice is good. His advice is good. But he goes and kills himself, right?
Hangs himself.
Hangs himself. Now, what is facing David? So what's the situation facing David?
Absalom's crossing the river.
Okay, Absalom's going after it, right, with his army. Because he has followed the advice and he's built his army. And now he's going to go after David. But he's given David time to do what? To cross the Jordan. So they're not trapping him on the other side of the Jordan. Also giving David time to
Rebuild a little bit.
gather his army. To gather an army. So now we got two armies facing one another. And what does David do with his army? What does David do? So Absalom is there in front of him. What does David do in chapter 18? What does David do with his army?
Appointed commanders.
Okay, he appoints commanders. Divides it into three parts, right? And Joab we know about because we've seen Joab before. Okay, and we've got each of these parts, right? Mm-hmm. And what does David say he's now going to do?
He's going to march with them.
I'm going to be with you. And what do his men say?
He said he shouldn't.
Oh, don't do it. Don't. Better to send us and you
Stay.
just stay in the city. So we'll send out, well, gracious, David, the great warrior, right?
Yeah.
The guy who is brave and decisive. Certainly he's going to say, no, boys, I'm going to be there and I'm going to fight with you.
No.
What does David say?
Stays beyond,
Yeah, he says, whatever you think.
Yeah.
And so David, as his army goes out to fight this incredibly decisive battle with a son that is rebelling against him, what is David doing?
Standing over there to kill Absalom.
He is standing by the gate of the city.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Cannot get worse than this. The king's army, David's army, is going to fight. David was going to fight with him, but his men said, don't do it. And David said, okay. And now he's standing by the gate of the city. His generals are about to go out and lead the battle. And as a pep talk to his generals, I want you to go out and I want you to defeat the enemy. You are fighting God's war. What pep talk does he give his 3 generals?
Do it gently.
Do it gently. Well, in fact, be gentle to Absalom.
Yeah, the one who's trying to kill
The
him.
one who's trying to kill him, who overthrew him, who took power.
Because he's his son.
Be gentle to Absalom. Now, the writer doesn't tell us, and therefore we don't want to assume, make or build something based on an assumption, because that's dangerous. Because we can assume anything. When we start drifting away from Scripture, because he must have felt this, or they must have felt that, that's always dangerous. Because unless the writer tells us, then it can lead us into weird directions. I mean, you can get it to say anything you want. If you imply motivation that isn't mentioned. So I don't want to suggest that the generals had any motivation. Although we're going to see that one of them did. One of them was affected by this. What do you think the generals felt as at the last conversation they have with the king whose life they are trying to save and whose kingdom they are trying to restore against a son that has rebelled against him in the most blatant way? How do you think those generals felt when David said, as you go to battle, please be gentle with Absalom? Do you think they said, thank you?
Yeah.
Now we're ready to fight.
How would his head get caught in a tree?
Well, we're not going to be there this week.
No.
We'll do that next week. We already know why. Because the writer's already told us. One of the characteristics of Absalom is he had, and it was, remember, it was so heavy they weighed it. You could weigh it. But be gentle to Absalom. Lord, have mercy. David is, we've now crossed the line. David is not just weak. He's almost unspeakably weak. But remember, what did Nathan say to him? You're going to have trouble in your house. You're going to have trouble in your house. And so this once decisive leader has become, what the army goes out in the field and they fight, and what happens as a result of the battle? Okay, David ends up winning. Big battle, huge battle. Slaughter, huge slaughter. The army of Absalom is crushed, right? Mm-hmm. And David is what?
Sad.
There at the city gate, waiting for news, worried that Absalom might get hurt. Mm-hmm. Absalom might get hurt. Next week we'll talk about what happens. And you know something? When you're looking at David, every time as we get past Bathsheba, every time we get to a point where we say, he can't get worse. He can't sink lower. He's hit rock bottom. David finds a little more room at the bottom of that barrel. There's just a little bit more room where he sinks, because he's going to go even further down and become even more pathetic. Now, again, I find this fascinating, that this is the story the redactor is telling his people. He doesn't have to. He doesn't have to tell them this story. He could tell the story about David being great. That David was a hero. And therefore, look at the past. I mean, when Parson Weems wrote the biography of George Washington, he didn't say George Washington had flaws. Wrote it in 1803, 4 years after Washington died. He didn't write it and say, oh, George Washington had plenty of flaws. He was human like everybody else. No, the angels in Weems' biography, the angels took Washington to heaven, for crying out loud, when he died. Lord have mercy. That was the cherry. He wrote the cherry tree and the dollar across the Potomac. He was the one that did that stuff. But Washington was a saint. He was close to almost a messiah in the way he presented, because Weems thought we needed national heroes. We needed a hero to look up to. We needed an example to follow. And so he gave us Washington as the example to follow, the paragon of virtue. He could have done the same thing with David, but he didn't. Why? Why didn't he do that with David? Especially since he was writing to a people that when they were first reading this, man, their fortunes were low. Judah was a client state for most of its late history, squeezed between two huge empires. And Judah was just trying to survive, usually by paying money to both. So they just let him alone. Judah was in bad shape. They weren't a mighty kingdom when the people are reading, and Israel is gone. There is no Israel. It's Judah by itself. Why would he do that? Why do you think the writer of Samuel would do that? Would put...
So you start to understand the rest that's coming?
Yeah, well, a lot's going to come.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a good... Ponder that. Just think about it. Why the writer... Because I find that to be a real interesting question. And I don't know there's any answer from the work itself. And that's what you got to look for answers. I just find it really interesting. Why would the writer present the one who is the closest you could come to a national hero? Maybe Moses would be high too. But in the Moses story, he couldn't enter the promised land because he disobeyed God. Mm-hmm. So Moses wasn't presented as perfect. And David here certainly isn't presented as perfect. Maybe there's something more important than David as a person in this story, involved in this story.
Maybe that's the purpose, to show
Show
you
you
there
that-
is no perfect.
Yes.
Maybe it
He's
is.
human.
And maybe, as just a reminder that this isn't David's story anyway.
And
This
besides,
isn't
just
David's story.
because you're a king doesn't mean that you don't have the ordinary feelings and stuff as a regular person.
And maybe that actions have consequences.
And also, where is the pillar, the monument to Absalom? It says it's there today. He named the pillar.
What verse are you talking about?
Down at the end of 18.
Too far.
Oh, yeah, I don't have that in my notes, because I don't have it that far.
Oh, okay.
We'll look at that. But that really points to something, a little point we've seen before. Because when we were looking at Joshua, way back, remember Joshua? Lord have mercy, that's a long time. Remember when Joshua led the people across the Jordan River? Mm-hmm. And what did it say? Because he did two things. Whether it's the same story or two different, I don't know. But remember, he had the people, the 12 tribes carry stones, right? And in one place they do what with they put the stones in the middle of the Jordan, because the Jordan River pulls a Nile and kind of dries up, stops. Mm-hmm. And the people cross on dry land, and they put stones down there in maybe the same story, maybe they do it twice, I don't know. But they also, there's a story that after they get on the other side, they put the stones on the other side of the Jordan. And in both of them, though, the writer tells us what? He says in both of those, it says...
Is that the one, they're still there today?
They're still there
Still there,
today.
yeah.
They're still there today. And that's what the writer will do. Why would the writer do that? Because that's the writer doing that. The writer is putting that in. Why would the writer put that in? That those stones are still there.
Because it's a special thing. It's marked
Okay.
where they go out,
Yeah.
went to and go out to the other side.
There's something tangible there that you know and you can see. So I'm kind of bringing you back. This is a story, but you can see the stones that are piled right there, or piled in the middle of the Jordan. They're still there. And I think that's what they've done before, even in Genesis, that you can see it because it's still there. It's still there. So as sort of proof to the people that it's there.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think that's what he's probably doing. But Absalom is defeated. His army's defeated, but we don't know about him yet. So we'll find out about him next week. Any questions? Great story. Really good story. He's a good writer. As he shapes these stories that have been floating around, pulls them into a narrative. Man, this is good stuff. Good stuff. Okay, next week we're going to look at 2 Samuel 18:9 through 20:26. So we got 2 more weeks in 2 Samuel. Think about what you want to do. We could go into Kings, which is continuing the narrative. And once we finish Kings, we've pretty much done the narrative. I mean, we could pick out bits and pieces afterwards, like Ruth, which is sort of extra to the narrative, and Nehemiah, Ezra, Esther. Those are sort of extra
What
to
do
the
we read
narrative.
for next week? 18.
We're going to do 18:9 through 20:26. So, but Kings, if you look at the books of the Kings, it doesn't get good.
I didn't study enough.
It's sort of,
I got to one point where I was just following along really good, and then I was like, what the heck's he talking about?
next week.
I studied it last year, but this year,
Yeah.
okay, I gotta have to go back and study.
One of the things to mention before we close, this same story is written again in the Bible. This same story appears again in the books of the Chronicles, in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, because 1st and 2nd Chronicles is also a history of this, written for a different audience by a different redactor. And so the writer of Chronicles is going to present this in a slightly different way because he's doing it to address what he thinks is most important. And probably written later, probably written by priests in a priest, because he really likes sacrifices. Big deal. The temple's a big deal in Chronicles. Building the temple, a lot of detail about that. Solomon becomes the great king as opposed to David in Chronicles, because it seems to be a more priestly. The redactor is more priest, and he's writing to an audience that values that stuff. So if you ever just want to read the same story written from a very different perspective, you can read the books of the Chronicles. 2 books that almost nobody reads. Nobody reads Chronicles. If you read the history, you read the King, Samuel and the Kings, but you don't read Chronicles. But it's the same story in Chronicles, just shorter. It's shorter, abbreviated. So, okay, let's have a word of prayer. Lord God, thank you so much for giving us this time together, and bless us as we go about our living. Remind us that we are part of your story, that we are certainly important because we are. But we're also part of your story, and your will is going to be done, and that our actions have consequences. Our behavior has consequences, both good and bad. So remind us of that as we go about our living. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.